You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Owen Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 35 of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today we are joined by David Robinson-Simon. David is a lawyer and advocate for sustainable consumption. He works as general counsel for a healthcare company and serves on the board of the APRL Fund, a non-profit dedicated to protecting animals. And today we'll be discussing his book, Meatonomics. David, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, when reading this book, so my fascination with this topic happened, I want to say, a couple of years ago when I made the change to start being a bit more responsible about not only my carbon footprint, but also the food that I put in my body, reducing my dairy consumption, but also my meat consumption. It was nothing to do with health-wise. It was very much to do with the environment based on watching documentaries like Cowspiracy and Knives Over Forks. So I think before we get into the details of the book, I think it'd be great to know how you became interested in this topic and why you believe it to be such an important topic to discuss.
I went down a path similar to the path that it sounds like you're on. I've lived in the mountains for a good portion of my recent life and had been concerned about the environmental impact, not just of the foods that we eat, but the way that we live. And so from my perspective, switching to a diet that is plant-based certainly contributes to a better environmental footprint. I also became aware of the ethical issues involved in factory farming 15 years ago or so, just before I became plant-based, and that largely informed my decision to do that. Why this particular book? I'm a lawyer and a left brain thinker. I tend to be logical and science-based. And it seemed like the existing literature didn't really provide a strong, logical, science-based argument to people like me for why a plant-based diet makes sense. And I was hoping that this book would help to fill that gap.
What was the information that you'd read previously then? How did that affect the way that you approached the book?
So I to some extent just had a number of life experiences that started to make me think more about the way that we as humans exist with animals. For example, I took a trip to Alaska. I describe it briefly in the book, where I watched people fishing king salmon out of the Kenai River. These are majestic fish that can be, they used to grow up to 5 feet in length. Today they still get pretty long, 2 or 3 feet. And it was just astonishing to me to see the ease with which people snatched these things out of the river and then sort of threw them on the beach and watched them writhe around and die. And it was the first time that I had seen such sort of a graphic display of what fishing really meant to an animal the size of, say, a golden retriever, a sentient being. And I sort of took that with me. Later, by accident, watched a documentary about Ingrid Newkirk, who founded PETA. And that documentary sort of made me think, maybe there is something more to this if people like Ingrid are changing their lifestyle because of it. And I started to inform myself about factory farming and the way that animals are raised for food.
What year was that?
That would have been 2008.
Okay. So were you seeing attitudes change at that time, or did you feel like you were still sort of fighting against the system at that point?
Well, if you fast forward to today, I would certainly say attitudes have changed significantly since the time that I went vegan or plant-based. back then, I think I was not on the cutting edge of change, but I was sort of one of the earlier adopters. It was still hard to buy things like good vegan cheese, good vegan meat products in the grocery store back then. Today, not hard at all. You can buy stuff in the grocery. I just ordered from an online place that's going to send me 2 pounds of vegan ribs. You know, it's so easy to get these great tasting foods today that it's really it's not hard to make a transition like this.
I think the interesting thing that so I've read some other books on this topic, whether it be Michael Gerda's book on like how not to die, which that one was a very much a scientific approach, but I felt like yours was very much based on, like you said, you're an analytical thinker, you're a logical thinker. So it definitely comes across in the book with the numbers. Did you want to expose the, let's say, from an economics point of view, the negative externalities around the meat and dairy industry? Was that the focus behind the book?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the main focuses, and for me, the reason why the externalities are so important is that they also drive very low retail prices. When a producer can shift its production costs onto the backs of society and not incur those costs itself, then the producer can sell its product for much lower retail prices, and that means they're going to sell much more of that product. And one of the main things that I attempt to show in the book is how the result of these very low retail prices, not just in the US, but in all industrial countries, have resulted in massive increases in consumption of animal foods over the last century.
Yeah, the example you gave, I remember it in the book rightly, is you said how if you went to McDonald's a couple of decades ago and you gave them $1, you'd still be able to, get like a cheeseburger. And if you do that today, you'll still be able to do it, and prices haven't increased. So do you feel like that's part of the reason why, I know it's prevalent in lower income groups, especially, they have a higher prevalence to eating this? Do you feel like some of the main reasons behind it not being not outlawed, but still a high consumption rate is just the ease of purchase, and there's not that tax on it, similar to cigarettes?
Yes, I think that's a huge problem for people for whom food represents a large portion of their budget. They really have to think carefully about what they're spending money on. And I think there's a huge draw to go somewhere like McDonald's or Taco Bell where you can buy a meal for $5. It's certainly not healthy food, but if you're on a low budget, you can do that.
And
We've created perverse incentives socially to encourage people to go out and buy the worst quality of food because that's what they can afford. It's something that we could certainly fix with some policy choices, but we haven't chosen to do that yet.
Yeah, the interesting thing for me on the policy side of it was, for instance, you gave the example about how nutritional advice in the US specifically, and I think this is systemic in the US, but perhaps not in the UK as much, the fact that you have industry leaders in fast food like McDonald's being on the American Society of Nutrition, and so they sponsor the American Society of Nutrition. So I read that and I thought, because I know I've watched some documentaries and know a bit about it. Do you feel like a systemic issue like that is a major hurdle to get across before you even start thinking about changing attitudes?
Yes, yes, it is, and it's not just at organizations like that. The USDA has a panel that every 4, 5, or 6 years provides recommendations to Americans on what we should eat. And that panel itself is typically dominated by people from the food industry. When I wrote the book, the most recent panel had 13 members, and 9 of them came from the food industry, so from companies like Kellogg, Dannon, etc. And naturally, they're going to advocate for recommendations that benefit the companies they work for.
So, yeah, as a lawyer, then what is the solution on that front?
Well, it represents a major challenge in the way we practice democracy in this country, and I don't think we're alone. And that is that there is just a tremendous amount of influence at every stage in the process. There's influence at the lawmaking stages, and then there's influence in the regulatory stages. And the challenge is to separate the important processes of making policy from the money and the influencers who are capable of reaching those policymakers, whether they're regulators or lawmakers.
Yeah, that definitely seems like a wider systemic issue, though, because that goes back to the whole party political funding. I know we've got some issues with that in the UK, but in the US, it definitely seems like it's more prevalent.
Yes, it is, and we've had recent Supreme Court cases that have made it even less likely that it's going to change anytime soon. So, and now with the given composition of our current Supreme Court, it's even more likely to change.
So do you believe? Then it feels like to me, probably you've seen the change since the book was first published in 2013. There's probably definitely been a change in general consumption and attitudes towards meat and dairy products. Especially in the younger generation. But it seems like from the lawmaker's point of view, it's perhaps got a bit more shielded. Would you say that was the case?
I think we've seen two phenomena develop over the last decade, and that is, yes, there has been some decrease in consumption of meat that's measurable. There's also been an increase in consumption of plant-based foods by people who typically think of themselves as carnivores. There are just so many more good-tasting plant-based foods out there that carnivores or flexitarians, omnivores, however people think of themselves, they're more willing to try some of these other foods, and that helps to lower demand for animal-based foods.
But from the you saying that with the Supreme Court, it's very difficult, and they've put barriers in place. So what is it at the moment that they've made it so difficult to pass stuff through?
Well, just on the influence issue, there's a Supreme Court case called Citizens United, which basically said that a corporation has the same right of free speech as an individual, and for that reason, one cannot restrict a corporation's ability to spend money to influence a political campaign. And when you have the amounts of money that we have, billions of dollars involved in each political campaign, you have lawmakers who get elected and are beholden to the corporations that contributed to them. So that's really the most important Supreme Court case on this issue. On the larger issue of the animal agriculture industry, I don't think we've seen a lot of significant legislative change in the last decade. In a few places, states have adopted laws that have animal welfare in mind, which is great. We've seen some new laws in California, Massachusetts. We've seen other laws. We've seen some other laws related to animals, not in the agriculture context. But I don't think there's anything that's tremendously far-reaching or that has affected demand for or consumption of animal products at the policy-making level. There's no meat tax, for example.
Do you think that would be, actually before we go on to that point, one of the things that you mentioned in the book was the fact that Oprah Winfrey had a case where on her show she said something against I think it was the meat industry, and she had a case against her that was only settled after a couple of years, and she had to pay like $1 million in litigation fees. So it's interesting. Do you feel like they are protected to a degree? The industry is protected because there is a vested interest from lobbying groups, and you can't even speak out against them. And if you are, you're somewhat vilified for some reason.
Yes, that's a major problem. So let's break that down for a moment. There's a tremendous amount of legislative protection for the animal agriculture industry in this country today in many different categories of law. There's the law that you mentioned, which is food defamation. A quarter of the states in this country have laws on the books that basically say if you say something that is defamatory about food, you might be held liable. That's what happened to Oprah. We also have so-called ag-gag laws that make it hard to investigate factory farms. We have these laws in every state called right to farm laws. These are laws that say that if you operate a factory farm and you pollute downwind people's homes, or you pollute, you dump sewage into the water system, in many cases you cannot be held liable or responsible, or you can't be made to change your practices. We have laws that make it hard to sue animal food producers, known as cheeseburger laws. These are laws we have in most U.S. states that say if you suffer from an obesity-related disease, you can't sue, for example, McDonald's or Tyson or anybody in the supply chain who provided you with and aggressively encouraged you to consume those foods. So the animal food industry has surrounded itself with this very powerful sort of matrix of legal protections. It makes it hard to penetrate, hard to hold them accountable, and it allows them to offload their production costs as externalities, largely with impunity, as we've seen.
I remember one documentary I watched, I can't remember which it was, but they were, a farmer was spraying, I think, watered down version of, I think it was like feces, I think, from a pig, and it was going downwind onto the neighborhood, and the residents were suffering from asthma, I think, or respiratory related illnesses based on that. And it's the fact that they were being encouraged to do so. It wasn't the case that they were being penalized for it.
That's very common. That's common. Those residents likely would have no recourse against that factory farm operator. And it's not only health issues. The research also shows that, for example, if you're unfortunate enough to live near a factory farm, the value of your home is likely to be depressed by a significant quantity. These are all costs that are measurable and are part of the overall figure for the externalized costs that this industry generates.
Talking about some of the detrimental effects, in the book you talk about subsidies. You were saying about how the fact that subsidies encourage the consumption due to reduction of prices, because by subsidizing it, you're reducing the price for the consumer, which then encourages them to do so. And in doing so as well, you're generating local tax revenue and also contributing to the decline of developing countries' ability to farm. Can you talk about how it's just not a local issue when you're encouraging subsidies, it's actually affecting developing countries and their ability to farm?
Yeah, so this is an important point. When, for example, our state or federal government subsidizes the production of a fairly universal crop like corn or soy, we effectively allow the producers of those crops to sell them more cheaply than they would have to otherwise. So just take an example. Say it typically costs $1 a bushel to produce corn. If we subsidize that and it now costs only 50 cents a bushel, then those corn producers can sell that on the market for 60 cents, slightly over their cost, still below what it costs anyone who's not subsidized. And the result is that, particularly in developing countries, we can underprice local farmers and sell our product more cheaply than they can and effectively put them out of business. We saw tremendous problems with this economists refer to this practice as dumping. You're selling something in another market at a significantly lower price than the local farmers can produce it. In Mexico, for example, when we dumped corn there a couple decades ago, we basically killed their domestic market for corn. We made it almost impossible for Mexican farmers to grow and sell their own corn. We reduced the Mexican minimum wage by about 20%. And we had all sorts of, that practice alone had measurable other detrimental effects on Mexico's economy. So
So the corn, sorry to interrupt, but that corn subsidy had a direct effect on the minimum wage in Mexico.
it certainly did. That's what the published research established.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Was that just is so was that a contributing factor for immigration as well?
Well, in an indirect way, yes, because we put some number of Mexican workers out of work, and those people then sort of logically would think, well, I'll now go to where the work is available, which for them would mean the United States. But when they try to enter the United States, they're turned around at the border, or if they make it across the border, they're rounded up and harassed because they don't have papers and that kind of thing. So it's a terrible vicious cycle.
Yeah, it seems like a terrible vicious cycle, and it's not observing it. It's not just the fact that by subsidies you're obviously, like you said, and you're saying in the book, it's undercutting prices, but it's also the fact that if you're looking at the production of these types of goods, it's like you don't have to look far to see, for instance, the detrimental effect it's having in like rainforest deforestation in the Amazon, and the effects that it's having just by pure land maths and methane production and all that kind of stuff. So the production of it is just not in your local area, it is everywhere. So it's somewhat of a collective issue. One thing I did want to talk about though is sort of away from like the litigation side and the policy side, was there seems to be a lot of conflating evidence around the benefits and the negative sides of consuming meat and dairy. Can you just talk a bit about why there might be perhaps conflating evidence about the benefits of either a meat-based diet and dairy-based diet as opposed to perhaps a plant-based or a vegan diet? And how can someone, for instance, who's looking to find objective evidence, how can they manage their way around that sort of murky terrain of scientific journals and sponsored scientific papers?
I discuss in the book some ways that the animal food industry has designed published clinical studies to create an appearance that animal foods are good for us. And with sophisticated study design, it's not all that hard to make the case. But if you actually go in and break these studies down, as I think you mentioned you've read some of Michael Greger's work, he's pretty good at that. He'll look at a study and explain why it's flawed. There's one that comes to mind where the study was intended to show that eating eggs is not bad for you. And this particular study compared two groups or cohorts. One group who ate an egg a day and one group who ate no egg at all. Now, the underlying problem is that both groups were significant eaters of animal foods. So you've got, say, people eating the typical consumption for Americans of animal foods, which is 200 pounds per year. So they're eating close to, let's call it a half a pound a day of animal foods. On top of that, one is eating an egg and one isn't. This study found that the egg eaters did not have significantly worse health effects from eating the egg than the non-egg eaters. Why is this study misleading? Because both cohorts are already starting from a base of significant consumption of animal foods. And when, in fact, as other studies do, you compare a cohort that is completely plant-based on one hand to a cohort that consumes an egg on the other hand, you actually see significant detrimental health effects from eating that single egg. If you break down the published studies that attempt to show that animal foods, whether it's dairy, eggs, meat, fish, are somehow good for us or as good for us as plant-based, you typically see that there's some misleading feature in the way the study is designed that makes it that allows it to generate this result. And as you know, it's easy to it's easy to manipulate data and manipulate statistics in a way that present a message that the hearer might find astonishing.
Creative
And
accounting
we
happens.
find a lot of that in these studies. Now, in the overwhelming, I read hundreds of studies, clinical peer-reviewed studies in writing this book, and I found that overwhelmingly, a plant-based diet is significantly healthier than a diet that is based on animal foods in every way. Greater longevity, lower cholesterol, lower body mass index, lower incidence of diseases like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. Just a tremendous lower incidence of autoimmune diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Crohn's. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. It's from my perspective, it's just impossible to refute. Although I agree with you that there are certainly people who love to pick that one study they found that says, "Hey, an egg a day is okay," and that's how they refer to that study, and say, "See, eggs are fine. There's nothing wrong with eggs," when it's simply misleading.
You also have prominent people in the press as well, advocating for a carnivore diet because it helps with perhaps their autoimmune issues. You've had that in the last couple of years. I know Jordan Peterson, who's an author and an advocate for the carnivore diet because it helped with his autoimmune issues. And you also have some athletes that talk about it as well. That probably doesn't help the cause, especially if they've got a large following, because obviously then they draw people towards it. So how does an advocate like yourself, perhaps you don't even try and tackle something like that, but how do you approach, for instance, if someone does come to you and ask a question about it, how would you approach that?
You know, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've sort of decided to choose my battles. So I rarely get into arguments about these kinds of things with my friends anymore. But when the issue does come up, I simply explain it the way I just did to you, which is say that the overwhelming body of published clinical peer-reviewed research establishes that a plant-based diet is healthier than a diet based on animal foods in virtually every respect.
I think secretly, David, everyone knows that. I think everyone, because when you grow up as a kid, your parents always like, oh, you have to eat your fruits and vegetables. You have to eat, like, everyone knows it's good for you. So I mean, for anyone to refute that, to me seems a bit ludicrous.
Well, people are very attached to foods that they like because they taste good, and they're attached to habits that they've formed over their entire lives. I like to drink a glass of wine every now and then. I know that the latest research establishes that there's no level of alcohol whatsoever that is healthy for humans. Have I completely stopped drinking? No. So I'm as irrational as anybody, I
mean,
suppose.
David, you have to treat yourself to at least wine. I mean, you're not eating the rest of the stuff.
That's
So,
right. That's
yeah,
right.
you mean you have to live a little, I guess. You can't just completely starve yourself of everything that's good. And I do agree. I think as culturally, I think food plays a massive role. And I think one of the barriers to it, and I know especially given my cultural background, is some things you just can't go anywhere without having because it's so ingrained in the culture and it's so ingrained in the food. And I can't just go to my grandma and be like, I'm not going to have this because it's got X in it. She'll just look at me and be like, eat it kind of thing. So that definitely plays a large role. I definitely think in the book you talk about organic food specifically, and I know in the UK the royal family, Prince Charles has a line of food called Duchy. I think it's called Duchy Original, but it's like he's advocated for organic food, and you talk about him in the book as well. Can you just talk about whether there's actually any benefits in producing and consuming organic food? Because from my limited knowledge, I just don't understand why it's a premium or what the particular benefits are of eating organic food. Can you just talk about a bit about that?
Certainly. So I think there are two different issues. The first is when we produce food, is it more sustainable which is another way of saying, is it more environmentally friendly to produce it in an organic or inorganic way? And just to look at that issue, in the book, I attempted to break this down fairly categorically by type of animal food. And what I found is that it's really not conclusive, because different types of production might be either more sustainable when done organically or more sustainable when done inorganically. For example, organic production requires more land, which is less environmentally sustainable, but inorganic production involves the use of pesticides and other chemicals, which offsets that. So, from a production perspective, at least with respect to animal foods, I don't think there is a clear winner between organic and inorganic, and I only bring that up because I think there's some, in the minds of some people consuming animal foods, there's this sort of mitigating factor that makes them think, well, at least if I buy organic, I'm buying something that didn't harm the environment. And it's just not true. It's not accurate to say that. We cannot generalize and say that. Separately, there's a question: when we consume organic versus inorganic foods, is there a difference? I don't think that there is a huge volume of published research on this issue yet, but I do think that there is at least a socially accepted view that if you don't consume things like pesticides, hormones, and other inorganic substances in your food, you're more likely to be healthy in the long run. It just makes logical sense. It makes common sense sense. But we don't have a significant body of clinical research that supports this yet.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up question, actually, was what detrimental effect is the percentage of those hormones and those pesticides, and what's it the actual food? Is there no evidence to back that hypothesis up?
Well, look at hormones for a second, because that's an interesting one. The UK has a different approach to that than we do. In the US, it is legal to inject dairy cows with bovine growth hormone, or to feed them bovine growth hormone. There is a significant body of research that suggests that consuming this hormone is not good for you. Among other things, it's got growth factor, which is a carcinogen, and it may be more likely to cause cancer in humans. A number of countries have banned the use of bovine growth hormone. Canada, Australia, many countries in Europe, and I believe the UK, because of a recognition that this stuff is probably bad for us.
Yeah.
It makes sense. It makes, anything. It makes cows grow faster and produce more dairy, and it's just logical to expect that the same growth factors that lead to those types of rapid growth would also promote rapid growth in cancer cells. I mean, it doesn't discriminate. It grows everything equally, so it's going to grow cancer more quickly too.
Yeah, I mean, we look unfavorably upon athletes who inject themselves with hormones, and yet we are okay with injecting food that we consume I'm assuming it's going to be a worse version of it, because obviously we're giving it to animals rather than ourselves. One thing I wanted to touch upon as well was the environmental factors behind the meat industry. And climate change is a massive thing at the moment. It's a massive policy agenda, whether it be from an international level, but also in national countries. Do you believe there's enough being done by, for instance, whether they be G8 countries or large organizations, multinational organizations, to combat climate change from a meat and dairy industry point of view, rather than perhaps just the transport industries?
I don't. Well, I guess I would answer that in two ways. I think it is increasingly on the radar that the way that animal foods are produced is a significant contributor to climate change. Uh, However, I don't think that significant action has happened yet to change or mitigate those practices. But it's encouraging that it's on the radar because for the first time we hear talk about it. You know, for example, Biden recently introduced a plan to address climate change, and Republicans jumped on it, saying inaccurately that he wants to take away our hamburgers. Now, that was nowhere in the plan, but I thought it was significant that there is recognition at a fundamental level that producing hamburgers is actually a contributor to climate change. And I'm sorry, but at some point we are going to have to reduce the number of hamburgers that we're eating if we want to combat climate change on all fronts.
From an economic point of view, if you look at anything that has been taxed in the past, you've obviously not seen a massive reduction in it. I know in the UK, probably the same in the US, they've put like a tax on tobacco, and that's been a massive reduction in the consumption of it, and especially in younger generations in the UK. Do you feel like a tax on meat and dairy is the biggest step that can happen in order for a reduction in consumption?
Yes, so we do see routinely across the board that when we tax a socially undesirable good like tobacco, we also do it with oil, and we also do it with alcohol. These goods are undesirable because they hurt our health, they damage our environment, etc. We're not going to ban them, but we tax them to reduce consumption and to generate tax revenue that we can use, for example, to help mitigate the effects, maybe to provide messaging. You know, in this country, when we tax tobacco, we use some of the proceeds to engage in messaging to discourage teenagers from buying cigarettes. So these taxes are shown repeatedly to be very effective, and that for that reason, I do think that if and when we start to tax meat, I do think it's a question of when. I think it's going to happen eventually. We will see a significant reduction in consumption, essentially tied to the level of the tax. It depends, you know, how much pain can we endure? If a 5% tax would probably reduce consumption by a few points. It's not significant, but a 50% tax, which is the order that I recommend, could have significant reduction in.
What evidence was the 50% based on? Was that through looking at similar products and taxing it at that level, or was it based on a study?
Well, I was not the first to come up with the idea of 50%. Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher and animal rights advocate, proposed 50% also. That particular number wasn't based on anything in particular other than the idea that in order to affect fairly significant change, we need to start with a fairly significant tax. And in the book, I break down how that tax and some other policy changes at the federal level in this country would reduce consumption by something around 47%, which is a tremendous reduction. Now, it's not to say people aren't going to be eating meat anymore, but that takes us back to about the level that we were consuming in 1940 on a per capita basis. And by the way, that level in 1940, when Americans were consuming that amount of meat, maybe 100 pounds per year instead of 200, we had 1/8 the rate of diabetes that we have today, and we had 1/3 the rate of obesity, and we had much smaller rates of other diseases that are closely linked to consumption of animal foods.
It seems like the relationship is indisputable, by the way, between the rise in consumption. Because I know, looking at other countries, I know I saw the rise in the consumption of meat and dairy in China, because they actually genetically not they're genetically not used to eating those types of foods, and then as it's made it into their diet, you've seen a massive increase in whether it be osteoporosis or whether it be diabetes and heart-related conditions. So yeah, I definitely don't think that's disputed. Talking about potential solutions, you talk about 3 in the book to counter the current situation. So could you talk about them individually and perhaps explain to what degree they are currently being met and how they can be met to a greater degree?
Well, the easiest and simplest solution is for an individual to simply change his or her consumption. And that might not mean going completely vegan, and it doesn't necessarily need to mean going completely vegan. It just might mean having a meatless Monday, or having a meal each day that is plant-based, or making some other routine but insignificant change in one's diet that means consuming less animal-based foods. Even at the lowest levels, like I think I talk about the fact that just having one meatless Monday a week is likely, based on the research, to improve one's health, to make one less likely to die, improve one's longevity, cholesterol levels, etc. So even a small change like that can have important personal consequences, and of course, important consequences socially as well, if it means reducing our dependence on this industry that is so harmful to us and to the environment. So there's that individual level change. At the policy level, there's the tax that we discussed, which is the 50% tax. In conjunction with that tax, because what's going to happen is people will find meat products to be more expensive, they will logically continue to buy some of those, so they will spend a little more money on those. I would also provide people with about a $500 a year tax credit. It's kind of the average. And that's designed to provide them with the additional funds necessary to buy the products, while at the same time helping to transition them over to more plant-based products. So at the end of the year, people are not going to be out of pocket at all. They simply will have shifted some of their consumption patterns. I would also change the way the United States Department of Agriculture works. This is one of our most tortured agencies in this country. I talk about many examples in the book of how this agency has these two conflicting objectives. On the one hand, it's literally pushing meat and dairy on consumers by telling us to consume more, by sponsoring things like checkoff programs and aggressive advertising campaigns. On the other hand, this is the same organization that is responsible for releasing dietary recommendations and telling Americans what to eat. So they're in this terrible conflict of interest situation where they're telling us, eat more cheese, and then they're saying, but don't eat more cheese. It's incredibly confusing. So the USDA should not have the responsibility for telling Americans what to eat. That should go to a different U.S. agency, the Department of Health and Human Services. And then all these other programs like subsidies and checkoff programs and all this crazy federal interference with this market should just be eliminated. And if we make all those policy changes, we would see a massive reduction in consumption on the order of 46-47%. A little more, a little less.
It's crazy that it sits in the Department of Agriculture, it doesn't sit in the Department for Health.
That is completely crazy. And by the way, just to finish this thought, if and when, I'd like to think when we successfully implement a meat tax on this order, we're going to save something like almost 200,000 human lives every year, 26 billion animal lives every year. We can reduce our carbon output by over 3 trillion tons per year, which is about the same as reducing all vehicles and vessels from the roads and rivers and waterways in this country. We can restore 700,000 square miles of land to its native habitat. I mean, just the benefits of reducing consumption are just overwhelming.
I think it'd be good as well to talk about the number that sort of is titled the book. It says for 114 billion reasons to eat less meat. Where does that number come from? And can you just talk to that a bit about how you came up with that figure? And just for anyone who is, for instance, interested in obviously reading the book, but obviously wanting to know where that figure comes from.
Sure. So $414 billion is the annual cost in terms of externalities that animal food producers impose on U.S. consumers every year. In other words, these are production costs that the producers of animal foods don't incur themselves. They impose these on other people. To put that number in perspective, 414 billion, it's about the same as the annual budget of Russia, or it's about the same as the annual spending in this country on Medicaid programs, which is health insurance for those who can't afford it. It's just a huge number. The biggest component of that number, a little over $300 billion, is healthcare costs, specifically related to consumption of animal foods. And these are mostly costs associated with the three big diseases, cancer, diabetes, and heart disease, that are known to be very closely causally associated with consuming animal foods, particularly at the high levels that we consume them in this country. And there are some other small health costs in there associated with things like E. coli, salmonella, antibiotic resistance. The other components constituting about $100 billion of that figure are subsidies in the area of 37 billion, environmental impacts in the area of 37 or 38 billion, fishing impacts of about almost 5 billion per year. And then I have a number associated with cruelty, which is about 20 billion. This is a number that some very interesting published research suggests American consumers would be willing to pay to eliminate a number of the most cruel practices in effect at factory farms.
I know you gave one graphic example of, animals going into wood chippers. I thought to myself, that's a bit mean. that's not nice. I know in the UK they passed, I know it was considered to be a landmark bill. I don't know if you heard about it, recognizing animals as sentient beings. I don't know if you read that.
I saw that. Wonderful.
Yeah. Is that making its way across the
It's
Atlantic?
certainly on the radar for some people, animal rights people in particular. UK is not the first country to do that. There are, I think, a handful. I think Israel is in that category, and some countries in South or Central America. Will the U.S. ever get to that stage? Who knows? There's been significant discourse at the higher levels. In fact, even a case was cited. A law review article was cited in the U.S. Supreme Court years ago that talks about whether, for example, trees should have standing to bring lawsuits, and there is some thought that if trees have standing, then animals do as well. So, there are smart, capable people who are pushing this issue on a daily basis, and it's.
What was the trees in reference to, may I ask?
Well, there's a fairly famous law review article called with the title "Should Trees Have Standing?" written by a philosopher and law professor named Christopher Stone, and the article was controversial when it was first published, but it was cited in I guess it was in a dissent, but cited nonetheless in a U.S. Supreme Court opinion. And the mere fact of its citation suggests that the idea is capable of gaining traction at some point. I don't think it has that level of traction today, although others might argue differently. There's certainly a lot of lawsuits brought to protect environmental features that are successful, and there are, on the same level, there are lawsuits being brought to protect animals as sentient beings, with a particular focus on chimps at the moment and elephants, because of their cognitive capabilities, that I think are starting to get some traction. And it just seems to be a matter of time before there is some court somewhere, probably in New York, it recognizes that an animal has a right, in some cases similar to the right that a human would have.
Who are the individuals raising these court cases? Is it companies?
So
Is it individuals?
it's largely an individual. So there's a animal rights lawyer, Stephen Wise, in New York, who leads an organization that has, with the help of many volunteers and other lawyers, has sought in a number of instances to bring what are called habeas corpus actions on behalf of animals. A habeas corpus is a very broad and general type of proceeding under the U.S. Constitution that basically seeks to have somebody released from imprisonment on some constitutional principle. So they are trying to get chimps mostly, but in some cases other animals, released from confinement on habeas corpus grounds. And it's a very interesting and novel approach. And they've gotten some level of responsiveness from the judges who have ruled on some of their cases so far. I don't think they've had a major win, but it's a sort of thing that one keeps plugging away. It took, for example, people started out suing the tobacco industry, and it took a lot of those lawsuits before they got any traction in this country and were actually able to get judgments and settlements. But most of those suits were initially just dismissed on the grounds that, everybody smokes, or you don't have standing, or, one thing or another. So, yeah, right. Well, it was even that initially.
Yeah, it's a cool thing to do. On the point of chimps, by the way, or animals in general, I was having this conversation with a family member recently. We were talking about when zoos are no longer going to be a thing, which is I think it's an interesting conversation to have, because I think the conversation of sentient beings and obviously food and animals, I think it's a combined conversation, because it's about the welfare of the planet and of individuals, whether it be yourself or other animals. So I don't know whether you have any thoughts about this, but we definitely think in this household that zoos are going to be a thing of the past shortly.
I'd love to see it. I'd love to think that it's possible. I've in the course of both my legal activity and my activist activity, I've met with some lawmakers in my country. One of them, most classically, was a very conservative sort of Trump brand guy named Dana Rohrabacher, who was a congressman in Southern California. And I think and I met with him because of a circus that was coming to town, and this was back at a time when circuses could actually use exotic animals. That's since changed, at least in California. And his response to me was that this is something that families love, children love it, it's educational, it's informative, and it's just in good fun. And I think that's probably a fairly typical response, not just for somebody on the far right wing the way he is, but for many mainstream Americans. My brother, for example, who takes his daughter to the zoo, would probably say something similar. And that's the level of attitude that I think it will be challenging initially to overcome.
Yeah, perhaps they need to go to a zoo like I did in Beijing and see a polar bear in 40-degree weather and be like, this is not right. There is nothing right about this.
I've been to some, it's terrible. You routinely see animals in these enclosures who are pacing or engaging in what's called stereotypical behavior. They'll pace, they'll beat, they'll bang their head on the bars. It's terrible to see. I mean, who would want to live like that?
It's not good at all. One of an ending question, I think a great way to end this conversation, it's been a fascinating one so far, is have you thought about, it's been... the book was originally published in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. So it's been somewhat 8 years. Have you thought about writing perhaps a follow-up to any new research, or what do you think a book written in 2021 would look like, and how would it change to what was written in 2013?
I do think about it every so often. This book was an enormous amount of work, I have to say. There's over 700 endnotes in it, signifying that I read 700 papers or books just to put it together. I don't know that I'm ready to embark on that level of activity again. I think the numbers will have changed a little bit, but I don't think that they will have changed significantly. That overall number of 400 billion might now be 500 billion, or it might even be a trillion, but it certainly wouldn't change or diminish the message. In any case, I think it would only enhance or make the message more powerful. So I don't know. Stay tuned. I continue to be involved in legal cases that challenge animal rights abusers or venues that don't allow activists to engage in activism and things like that. So at the moment, I've got a half a dozen or so of those lawsuits on my plate that I'm continuing to handle.
So what do those lawsuits look like? I'm sure you can't talk about it in too much detail, but it'd be good for anyone listening to this to know what actually that looks like.
For example, I'm challenging the production of foie gras, which is French for fatty liver. It's made by force-feeding ducks in very painful ways. It often kills them or leads to disease. It's been banned in California, but it's still legal in New York. Most of the big producers in this country are based in upstate New York, so we're challenging them based both on California law and on New York law. And I also have a lawsuit challenging a religious ritual known as caparot, in which religious practitioners slash the throats of chickens as a way of expressing atonement.
Which creed is that?
These happen to be Jewish Orthodox practitioners of a particularly, I would say, extreme form of Judaism.
Okay.
And I brought, with co-counsel, I brought either 4 or 5 of these lawsuits so far. And the courts, because of the First Amendment in this country, which protects religious exercise, the courts have been very reluctant to interfere in this process, which is odd because, look, I'm the first to agree that one should be able to think and believe whatever one wants in terms of religion, but that doesn't extend to killing sentient beings. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, those are a couple representative cases I'm involved in. In some other cases, there are activists who want to get onto the property someplace and engage in free speech, protected again under the First Amendment, and they're being told they can't. One of these was at a major horse track in Southern California called Santa Anita, and we brought a lawsuit to enforce free speech rights and ultimately prevailed on that. And I have some other cases, some other free speech cases like that are ongoing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to raise. Do you believe in, I know from a dietary point of view, it's obviously you advocate for a plant-based or a vegan diet, but is there obviously some sport that you advocate for not promoting, like horse racing, or whether it be greyhound racing or whatever it might be?
Well, my own philosophy, which is grounded in veganism, is that animals are not ours to exploit for food, testing, or entertainment. Okay. So I'm not a fan of horse racing, dog racing. I'm not a fan of even horseback riding, particularly. Some people might think that extreme, but hey, I live in a place, I live near Reno, Nevada, where we see wild Mustangs out on the plains all the time, and they love to be wild and free. They're not seeking to be imprisoned and put in a barn every night and then have humans riding them. So I think those animals prefer their natural state.
Yeah, their natural state of running around and being free. Perfect. Thank you so much, David, for taking the time to speak with us about your book, Meatonomics. There's a lot to learn from this book, and there's a lot to learn from this conversation, so I appreciate you taking the time. Where's the best place for anyone to find you on the web if they want to find out any more information?
I do have a website at meatonomics.com where there's information about me and the book, and there's a contact page that people can use to contact me.
Yeah. Any questions, I'm sure you can reach out to you. Thank you, David.
Certainly. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.